Okay, good afternoon. I'm Helen Rinsberg, president of the Cincinnati Asian Art Society, CAAS to our friends. We're very happy today to present today's talk, a report on the completion of the first project funded by the CAAS Conservation Fund. Thanks to the generosity of our members, Dr. Margaret Graves conducted an evaluation of the Islamic Ceramics collection at the Cincinnati Art Museum. This brought to light some fascinating stories about how CAM acquired high-quality artworks and information about their creation. Our speaker, Margaret S. Graves, is Associate Professor of Islamic Art in the Department of Art History at Indiana University. She received a PhD from the University of Edinburgh in 2010 for her research on the plastic arts of medieval Islamic world, and her research has been supported by the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the British Academy, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council of Great Britain, amongst others. Her 2018 monograph, Arts of Illusion, Object, Ornament, and Architecture in Medieval Islam, Oxford University Press, was awarded the 2019 Annual Book Prize from the International Center of Medieval Art and the 2021 Karen Gould Prize in Art History from the Medieval Academy of America. And now I'm turning over my screen to Dr. Graves for her presentation today. Thank you.
So I want to begin, obviously, by extending my very sincere thanks to the Cincinnati Asian Art Society because they made it possible for me to visit the collection last year. And I did, while I was there, conduct 4 days of masked and socially distanced research in the collection storage at the Cincinnati Art Museum. So this was really quite a thing. This was the only research trip I undertook last year. I think it was the only research trip anyone in my department undertook last year. So I'm deeply grateful to the Society for making this possible. I also want to thank, and I'm very pleased to see that they're here actually, I want to thank Ainsley Cameron, the curator of South Asian art, Islamic art and antiquities, and Trudy Gaba, curatorial assistant for SAME, as well as the conservator Kelly Rechtenwald and the handling team. Now there are, as I'm going to just begin to show today, really a lot of Islamic ceramics in the museum's collections. And it was only through the very enthusiastic support and cooperation of all of these people in the teeth of the pandemic, let us remember, that made it possible for me to undertake this research and see all of these objects and all of their documentation too, which, as I'm going to show you, is quite important. Being able to see all that at first hand was invaluable. So I won't show you everything, of course, in the Islamic ceramics group today, because there are well over 130 objects, so it really would not be feasible for a lecture. This slide is showing you just a few. Many of these pieces are included in the report of recommended standout pieces for display consideration that I've submitted to Ainsley and Trudy last year. And I'm going to talk about some of these in a bit more detail in the second half of this presentation. So what I would like to do today, because there's so much stuff, I was trying to think about the best way to organize this. What I want to do today is pause and begin this by talking about the very interesting collecting histories that these pieces represent. I'm also going to explain a little bit about the route by which I actually arrived at them and why I contacted the Cincinnati Art Museum in the first place. And that will then give way in the second part of the talk. I want to maybe zoom in and talk a little bit more closely about some of the individual pieces. It's a superlative collection. It's a really, really good collection and a really important one, and I don't think it's received the attention that it should have. So I'm going to bring out some standout pieces, but also talk a bit more about some of these collecting history issues. So my first contact with the museum came about through it's a large-scale project that I've been working on for several years, which is about the effects of the art market itself on the collecting of Islamic ceramics. So I'm particularly interested in the movement of pieces through the art market. And these are, of course, objects that moved all the way from the Middle East to America. As well as I've also become deeply interested in the undocumented early 20th century practices of restoration that so many of these pieces bear. So this is, to make it clear, I'm not talking about the conservation that these pieces have experienced after they've come to the museum. I'm talking about the stuff that happened to them on the art market before they got to the museum, which pretty much invariably is undocumented. You've got the object itself as the evidence. There isn't going to be a kind of paper trail about that art market restoration. I've come to that topic through years of working in public institutions and private collections, and I have spent a lot of time marveling over ceramic objects in their totality, including all of their undocumented restoration work and the huge spectrum of skill that represents. Now, the images that I'm showing you here show two kind of strands in the collecting history of Islamic ceramics. This is an image of Cogorkian's commercial excavations at Ray in Iran, 1904. And it was through excavations of this type that an awful lot of the material that's now in collections worldwide entered the art market. It wasn't through scientific excavation, it was through commercial excavation. And usually there isn't any hard and fast documentation with the objects. What you see down below, these are the scholarly excavations at Ray. This is the same site, but considerably later after the dealers picked it over. This is the workshop where you can see some of the restoration work going on, where the pieces are being reconstructed and put back together. You can see a lot of plaster work here. Now, there's a distinction between what's going on in the scholarly context, where it's very deliberately being kind of recorded carefully what is being done to the objects, and what happens in the commercial context, which we see much more of in the museum world. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we look at the individual objects. But to talk about the project itself, the whole of this kind of move on my part, because I am trained as a medievalist, so I came at the objects first as a medieval art historian, looking at them as medieval objects. But I've come through that into this larger scale project because it became very striking to me. I moved to the Midwest of the US in 2012. So I moved here from Scotland in 2012 to start my job at IU. And over time, I started to realize just quite how impressive the holdings of Islamic ceramics are in the Midwestern museums. So these are the major ones that have significant collections, obviously Cincinnati itself too, but also the Toledo Museum, the Detroit Institute of Art, the Cleveland Museum, the Ashkenazi Museum at IU, which is actually where I started working on all of this, St. Louis, Chicago, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the Nelson Atkins. This is a lot, actually. This is a lot, and there's a huge amount of material if you look at this all together. I, as an outsider, was fascinated by the fact that this material isn't as well known as some of the other Islamic ceramics collections. Unlike the best known collections mostly in Europe and on the east coast of the US, many of the Midwestern collections, most of them were formed sort of around the mid-20th century. Many of them have never actually had Islamic ceramic specialists in post or working nearby necessarily. We're a pretty small band, the people who work on this. So a lot of these collections have been left largely unpublished, although certainly not all of them. There have been some very important publications brought out by some of my colleagues. But the consequence of this is that some quite amazing material, most of it acquired in the middle decades of the 20th century, has, I think, been rather overlooked. In a lot of places, a lot of it has also been left largely unconserved. So the art market restorations on these pieces are becoming increasingly obvious as overpaint degrades and adhesive weakens. Although the conservation work undertaken by Kelly Rechtenwald at the Cincinnati Art Museum is a shining example, I think, of sensitive practice in this area, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit more later on. Naturally, a major question that's driving this research is how all these pieces got here. So how did they all move out of the Middle Eastern export centers of Tehran, Aleppo, Istanbul, and Cairo? Those are the primary sites. How did they all end up in the American heartlands? To try to track this movement has meant, as you can imagine, a lot of research in collection archives. So really hundreds upon hundreds of pages of museum documents that illustrate the large-scale shift of financial firepower for competitive Islamic art collecting. You can really see this happen through the 20th century. Prior to World War I, Paris is really the focus. Then you see things move. Paris and London get left behind. And after World War I, increasingly, it's New York that becomes the primary focus for the market. So there's this kind of mid-20th century kind of final episode or kind of coda to all of this in the American Midwest. Now, some of the major dealers who sold this material, I'm talking specifically about the ceramics today. Some of the major dealers who sold this include, so Dikran Kelekian, who will be the primary focus today, Cogorkian down here, Parish Watson, Fahim Kujakshi, this is actually his parents, I haven't been able to find a picture of him, Hassan Khan Monif, and the scholar come broker come dealer Arthur Upham Pope, who's shown here in a very famous photograph with Helen Keller. So for today's talk, I'm only going to be talking about one of these men, Dikran Kelekian, but he is the one who's by far the most important in the formation of the Cincinnati collection of Islamic ceramics. Kelekian was born in Kayseri in Turkey and was a very successful and well-known dealer in historical Islamic art. So he is extremely important beyond just his role in the Cincinnati Museum. Now, Kelekian's story is an interesting one. I'm going to take us back to this publication here. This book was published in 1910, and this becomes actually really central to the story. In the early years of the 20th century, Dikran Kelekian assembled a large group of ceramics from Iran and other Middle Eastern territories. There were quite a few from Syria and Egypt as well. He published 112 of these in this very expensive catalogue. This is produced in 1910, and it has full-page plate illustrations of every single piece in it. So it's a big, expensive production. Now, this is obviously part of a kind of salesmanship. It's in that era when there's a little bit of a kind of, it's kind of hard to say, are you a dealer, are you a collector? But Kelekian was very much a dealer. I mean, he continually added to and sold on and bought and moved around pieces in his collection. This particular publication was instrumental in getting a group of Kelekian's pieces, the ceramics that are contained in this publication, because I think partly because they're in this luxury publication, this opened the door for him having them housed as a long-term loan at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Now, this is very significant because, of course, what this did was give Kelekian's collection a great deal of pedigree and status and visibility. So this group it really became an iconic collection through its publication and through its display in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it remained in the Victoria and Albert Museum, the whole of the group in this collection, in this publication, plus some more that he added to it. They remained in the V&A collections all the way through 2 world wars. They remained as a loan that entire time, which is going to turn out to be critical, and I'll explain why in a moment. But so all the way through 2 world wars, this stuff all stays in London in the V&A. The reason I actually stumbled onto this collection in the first place is because 2 pieces in it are actually now in Indiana University. They're in the Ashkenazi Museum of Art here. And so I found this as I began work on our ceramics collection here, which is another part of this project. I'd be happy to talk about that after in Q&A too. But of course, this raised questions in my mind. I was fascinated. Why was this very iconic pedigreed collection? How had these pieces ended up in a university art museum in Indiana? It's not where one might anticipate seeing them. As I started to dig deeper, I wanted to find out where the rest of the pieces in this collection had ended up. And I discovered that a full 15 of the, including some of the really significant pieces, are all in the Cincinnati Art Museum. So this job of tracking these pieces really got me started on the trail of all of these objects as this group is a kind of paradigmatic collection for charting the global movement of the pieces. Now, I've spent a lot of my spare moments in the last sort of year trying to track where everything is. This is where I found all pieces from the Kelekian 1910 publication now. So there's a whole bunch that are still in the V&A, and I'll talk more about that. There's one in Italy, there's one in Japan, and there are several collections in the United States. They're worldwide, but the 2 largest groups are the ones held in Cincinnati and the one held in the Al Sabah collection in Kuwait. Those are the 2 biggest single kind of tranches from the Kelekian collection. Now, I was delighted and very excited to see when I got to Cincinnati to start looking at the pieces in person. I mean, it's always a wonderful process. One of the things that really blew my mind is we actually found on 2 of the objects in Cincinnati, we found the original handwritten labels in Kelekian's handwriting, which I'm now very familiar with. pasted onto the bottom of the objects. This one also has this little sticker here that says lent by Mr. Kelekian, number 179. This is from the V&A. So this is from the piece's time in the V&A. And this is a real object lesson for any of you who have collections, and why it's wonderful to keep all the labels on. These become such an important archive of the object. So looking through the pieces that are in Cincinnati and looking through the documentation in the archives as well, it became clear that there had been two major bands of purchase, or two major periods of purchase of Islamic ceramics from Kelekian's collection. The first batch were purchased in, they were actually formally accessioned in 1948. It looks like the purchase was going on through 46 to 48. It's a big group. It includes at least 72 pieces. There's an earlier mention of 32, which I'm trying to work out if I think that's part of this final 72. Then there's a second group acquired in 1952. This is 32 pieces from the estate collection in the V&A, and that's what I'm really going to focus on. The thing that happens in between these two accessions is the rather shocking story of Kelekian's death. Dikran Kelekian apparently committed suicide at the age of 83. He jumped from the 23rd floor. I mean, it's sort of lurid stories, but he jumped from his hotel room in the St. Moritz Hotel. It is unclear, reading around it, obviously people are rather circumspect in their discussions of it, even in the archives. It's unclear what the motivation was here, whether he was of sound mind or not. But certainly it was an extremely shocking occasion. What also happened as a result of this was that the entire collection in the V&A basically was left intestate. I'm putting these up. These are two letters which I found in the archives at Cincinnati. This is only because this is a kind of curious bit of the sort of human story here. This is actually a letter written by Dikran Kelekian to Philip Adams, the director of the Cincinnati Art Museum, the day before he died. On January 29th, which is entirely business as usual. It's about a silver plate in Iran. It's entirely in keeping with Kelekian's normal business correspondence. This piece, this memo I found from slightly later is a curious one. It mentions that there was another letter, presumably sent the same day as this one, marked personal, that was returned to Kelekian's son. So it seems that Philip Adams was, and this is certainly borne out by the intensity of the correspondence in the last few months of Kelekian's life. It seems that Philip Adams and Kelekian were in quite close contact towards the end of Kelekian's life. And in some of these letters, it seems that Kelekian is or Adams is almost a kind of confidant for Kelekian. So there's an interesting relationship going on there. What became sort of more problematic in terms of the actual objects is this condition of V&A pieces. Like I said, basically they became sort of objects intestate. Kelekian died, and at the time of his death, the pieces were still on loan to the V&A. This started up a legal dispute between the V&A and Charles Kelekian, Kelekian's son, because the V&A maintained that Kelekian had always intended to leave the pieces to the V&A, that they were going to be a bequest to the nation, essentially. And certainly I read the correspondence in the V&A, you could definitely read it that way, in that certainly the amount of time that they were there for, the way that they were cared for, the early discussions with Kelekian don't really say anything about it. It's not an unreasonable assumption to make, but it's not there in any kind of binding writing. So what actually happens in the end is that this legal dispute resolves in the favor of Charles Kelekian, Kelekian's son. And what happens with the pieces, those objects that have been in the V&A since 1911, get shipped to the US in 1951 to 52, where they are sold by Kelekian's heir and successor in the business, Charles Kelekian. And you can actually, I've managed to piece together the process of all of this through a parallel reading of the archives in the V&A, which I got to 2 summers ago, and the archives in the Cincinnati Art Museum. So what we have in the V&A, I'm showing you here, there are a lot of memos and handwritten assessments of the Kelekian collection by the museum's curator and scholar of Islamic ceramics, Arthur Lane. So he went through all of the pieces that belonged to Kelekian that were in the V&A, and he prioritized pieces by their desirability for the collection. You see him going out, seeking valuations, doing all of this research. But you can also see in the correspondence in the archives that Lane gradually loses hope that the V&A is actually going to get to keep these pieces, because the letters from Charles Kelekian's New York lawyer just keep piling up. So in the end, the way it panned out is that the V&A were offered first refusal of this group. And they bought a tranche, they bought a group of 15 pieces using money from the National Art Fund in the UK. The V&A then apparently approached Charles Kelekian with a proposal to purchase a second group of 32 pieces from the Kelekian collection. This is where Cincinnati comes in. Because Kelekian then apparently took the V&A's offer and went to Cincinnati with the list of that 32 pieces that the V&A wanted and asked Cincinnati what they would be prepared to pay for them. So in the archives in Cincinnati, I found the handwritten notes from Philip Adams. It looks like it's from a phone conversation, probably, in 1952 with Charles Kelekian, where Kelekian, it's clear Kelekian is telling him Cincinnati haven't offered enough in their initial offer for these 32 pieces. The V&A is offering more, and will Cincinnati go higher? Cincinnati actually only went $700 higher, it looks like, but that was sufficient apparently, and they got the whole group. And that group, it's worth pointing out, was probably selected largely on the basis of the work done by Arthur Lane in the V&A, because in Cincinnati at this point, there were no experts on this particular kind of material on its staff at that moment. All of this, I think, is interesting, and it's not to sort of cast aspersions around the dealings of the past. This is all pretty much business as usual. But I think it's interesting because it shows that in this kind of new financial environment where American and Western museums had some pretty serious buying power at this point, even without an expert who could sort of translate and mediate the material on staff, still Islamic ceramics were felt to be a really important thing for a major civic museum like the Cincinnati Museum to have. So we're seeing the rise in status of this material that's taking place at this point as well. This is also right slap bang around the time that the Cincinnati Museum buys the really interesting forged manuscript, the Andarsname manuscript, which launched a bit of a scandal at the time. It's a fascinating document. This manuscript is really interesting. I'm hoping that Ainsley and I can continue a collaborative project on this. I bring it in here just to sort of add to this idea that it's very clear that historical Islamic artifacts had become a really hot commodity in the art market by this point in the mid-20th century. And they had actually become, I think, a necessity for an American civic museum that wanted to be taken seriously. So that's how we see the kind of background to this acquisition of these pieces. And this triangular exchange between the Cincinnati Art Museum and the V&A down here is, I think, a very illuminating portrait of that mid-century financial shift that's going on, where a lot of firepower is moving to the Midwest. And Islamic ceramics are moving within this as a commodity that has gained sufficient cultural capital to really raise the status of the institution by this point, with or without an expert on staff to actually mediate them. So that's the background to how these pieces ended up in Cincinnati. And what I want to do now is look at some of these pieces individually to look and explore a little bit what they can tell us, because there are two different sort of levels that I've been approaching this material. One is as medieval objects and what they can tell us about the processes of their manufacture in the medieval era. The other, which I'll move to afterwards, is about objects that have also, most of them have been remade to some extent on the 20th century art market as well. So looking at those two things in parallel and understanding them not as problems, not as one obscuring the other, but as the kind of truth of the objects. We can see when we start to look at them, this is a wonderful piece from Raqqa. It's a pretty crude, the paste itself is quite crude, but there's wonderful, wonderful painting on top of it, this really thick glassy glaze. You can see when you start to look at the object, traces of production that come through in things like this part here, where we have a kiln. It's a sort of standard kiln mishap. A bit of another object has actually gotten stuck to this during firing. And because this is a luster piece, we know this must have happened during the first firing, but there's been a decision to just go ahead and do the second firing with the luster on it anyway. This is one of a really beautiful group of 5 pieces that are all in the Cincinnati Art Museum now that come from a really important, highly regarded body of material that came out of Raqqa in the early 20th century, which we attribute to the late 12th, early 13th century. These are partner pieces for pieces in the Metropolitan Museum, and pieces in the Freer have the two kind of major collections of these. So these are really significant objects in and of themselves. And they're also really important objects in this art market history. 4 out of the 5 of these actually appear in kind of seminal early 20th century publications. Other things that we can see taking place, and this I wanted to talk more about because, again, it's an absolutely stunning object. This is so-called Gon Brunoir, which has been attributed all over the place, but we now are fairly certain this is produced in Iran. This is probably from the early 18th century, this piece. What typifies it, you can see this beautiful, beautiful, extremely kind of shiny, also quite creamy colored white glaze on it. These are incised pieces and you can see with the piece upright really clearly the way that they're supposed to work, the play of light that you get. So these incisions are so small that the glaze will fill them in. So you won't actually get holes, but you get these little opaque designs where the glaze fills them in. Beautiful pieces, but again, this is another one that's actually had a kiln mishap. You can see it more clearly at this angle. It's quite slumped. When you see it in Ainsley and Trudy and I all sort of noticed that it looks a little bit drunk. It's slumped over to one side. Again, speaking of these kinds of processes, it's part of the actual science of ceramics that you will have multiple things that can go wrong in the kiln or go slightly wrong. And there's always a decision made with those pieces about whether to go ahead with them and sell them, which obviously has been the case with this one because it is a beautiful, beautiful object. It's just tipped slightly over. Another piece that, again, attests, it's this kind of, because we don't have documentary records, these pieces that can really tell us about the processes of production are amongst the things that I really love within this group. This one, it's a luster bowl from Iran, and the inside is it's very nice. It's entirely in keeping with others of the type of the time. It's got quite a complex design, this kind of almost Mobius loop kind of banding that's going on. There's a figure in the middle. It's quite worn and it's hard to read. What I actually particularly love about this piece is the outside of the object. Now it has this design on it, which is quite common on Kashan Iranian lusterware of this particular time period. This kind of cotton ball, it sort of looks like a puffy cotton ball design going around the outside. But what I really love about this piece is it shows us improvisational thinking on the part of the painter too, who's doing this painting in luster, that they got to the end and they realized they did not have enough space in here to do a full shape of the cotton ball. So a design was improvised that would be symmetrical, that would fit, that wouldn't look too awkward, but also ultimately still draws your attention to the fact it's a little slip up in planning, that there was a space that didn't quite work left at the end. So this kind of thing, and Ainsley and Trudy, it was brilliant having the time in storage to look at these pieces and talk about this stuff and have these wonderful interlocutors to work through this with. This kind of thing is really some of the stuff that really motivates and animates me as a scholar of this material, because it's where we can see things that we have nothing in textual records about how medieval painters and potters thought or how they went about their processes. We have just a tiny handful of documentary sources. But something like this, you can actually retrace the steps of design and realize what happened and see the traces of the thinking hand at work trying to overcome this particular challenge. As we journey further into thinking about these pieces themselves and the processes of manufacture that they attest to, we also then have to think about the restoration work that's been done on them too. And this is where I come to the kind of core focus of my project, and one of the ways in which the Cincinnati pieces are really interesting for that. So one of the things that many of the pieces in the Cincinnati collection share with all of the collected Islamic ceramics in the world is that lots of them have been reconstructed to some extent. It's completely unsurprising that this should be the case. Ceramics, obviously, until you get to about the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, prior to that, it's pieces that are coming out of the ground. The idea that they would survive intact is, almost kind of insane. So Most, virtually all of the early materials have been reconstructed from fragments. And that's where we start to see this art market restoration taking place, where you start to see the practices of the art market at work. Now, this is a wonderful example for thinking about this, because this is actually an incredible piece. This is one of the very earliest pieces in the collection. It's a fairly small bowl. It comes from Iraq. It's so-called Samarra luster, associated with the site of Samarra in Iraq. It's 9th century in date, so this is amongst the earliest Islamic lusterwares that we have surviving. It's a beautiful piece. Now, you can see quite clearly from looking at it that it's been reconstructed across here, but we have about 2/3 of the piece. You can see there's been fragments stuck back together, but they all belong completely together. About 2/3 of the piece is clearly the original object, and we get the beautiful shape of it. It has this gorgeous, it's actually pretty fine walled considering it's earthenware. It has this gorgeous fluted, kind of fluted shape, and this amazing, rather psychedelic radial design in the middle of it. I think it's a wonderful piece, considering how kind of messed about with most of the early Iraqi luster is that we have surviving in the world. This piece is in incredibly good condition. The bit that's been reconstructed is marked very, very clearly. You can see that quite easily. Somebody at some point has cleaned off some of the art market painting that's visible in earlier photographs of this object. And I think an object like this, it tells us so much about its own time, but it tells us also about that subsequent passage through the art market. Without that obscuring the object itself, we can still see this for a really, really lovely piece of pottery, which is what it is. Other pieces that I think I would put into this category as well, and this is one of the standout pieces in the collection. This is a plate from Iran, probably from Kashan. We can attribute it to the very high period of Iranian luster production, late 12th, early 13th century. As you can see, it's very fragmentary, but it's very big is one thing. You don't get a sense of the scale from this. This is a huge dish originally. So even the fragments that we have surviving are actually quite sizable. It's an amazing design. You have these dancing dervish figures with these long trailing sleeves going all the way around. What they originally held up, you can see just the traces of Cancer the crab here. They're holding up roundels of the zodiac. And down here are personifications of the planets. Even in this fragmentary state, I really would urge you, if you ever get the chance to look at this piece, to really look closely. Look at the incredible skill of the artistry, working in luster like this, using color on white, using reserve, and the incredible complexity of the figures too, and the way that they're interacting, the dynamism of their movement. It's a really stunning piece. So even in this very fragmentary state, we have something, and this one very honestly attests, so much of this Kashan luster, what we have now, has been very heavily overpainted, and it's very hard to tell what's what. This piece has been carefully conserved, and you can actually see how it was originally reconstructed on the art market from this much earlier picture of it. So this is the crab over here. Using that as your guideline, you can see how much extra material had actually been completely invented and added in up here. Where we start to get into really interesting, funny little kind of idiosyncrasies, you could call them. This piece is a really good example of this. It has something I have never, ever seen before on any other piece in any collection. This is a complete, so it's actually very rare. It's a complete and intact luster bowl. It's again from Iran, probably the early 13th century. It has poetic quatrains around the edge of it. And this design of a gazelle in the middle, and the gazelle stands for a beautiful woman, often in Persian poetry. So it's a kind of poetic object. What we have here that really startled us when we noticed it is that someone has actually inked on here a date. And when I went away and looked, I discovered that Kelekian had actually published it in the 1910 catalogue, saying that it had a date on it. He says it has a date of 668. I went back and looked in the V&A's records, and Arthur Lane queries this. He says, does it really have a date? He's not convinced that it's actually what it says. But somebody, somewhere along the line, and I think it was probably Kelekian, has actually inked in a date on top of it to try to bolster the case for this being a dated object, dated objects obviously being more valuable as well, and has written directly on the surface of the object. It's quite startling. Obviously, it's not a thing that anyone would do now. but it's a really interesting part of the history of the object. And I had a look at the earlier photographs of this piece, and you can see it in all the earlier photography of it. So it looks like, I think probably Kelekian did it himself. Now, with all of these things, I want to emphasize that it's very important not to think of these modern interventions on the object as a source of shame or failure. There really is no such thing as a pure artifact of the past through which we could somehow touch the unmediated medieval experience. The medieval and the modern are always entangled, and this is nowhere more apparent than in this material. Islamic ceramics, because of the history of their collection, because of their inherently fragmentary nature when discovered, because of the way that they moved through the colonial program, they really embody this kind of interface between the medieval and the modern. And I would point here to Kelly's work on the Cincinnati Art Museum collection. So Kelly Werchtenwald's work. I think I really see the work that she's done on this collection as being at the vanguard of a larger movement that we can see going on at the moment towards greater transparency about the condition of Islamic ceramics and what transparency can tell us about the circumstances of their collection. So this is the old display that had some of Kelly's restoration work up. This I would link with, this was a small exhibition that was held at the Metropolitan Museum in 2016, specifically about this, about the restoration, the transformation and the faking of Islamic ceramics in the 20th century. And also anyone who's been to the Walters Museum in 2018, they reinstalled their Islamic ceramics collection, and they have a lot now of information about the condition of the objects in relation to these questions about reconstruction. You can see they've gone all out and actually used the word forgery, talked about the forger's art, but we're talking about a sort of spectrum of activities here. So I want to put that in there because I think the work that Kelly has done on pieces, and I'm not really showing you her restoration work, but I think that's been incredibly important actually with this collection. Staying with these questions about workshop restoration and this idea of, and I think we can use the word faking when we talk about this, I want to move to one of the most puzzling objects in the collection. This is a handled stone paste vessel. It's decorated with a type of figural overglaze decoration, which was very, very popular with early 20th century collectors. It's a very finely potted example of the type. When you look down into the interior, you see here, you can see the traces of the hand that turned it on the wheel. It's a lovely object. A lot of it is one continuous piece. There's obviously fragmentary reconstruction on the top, but quite a lot of it is actually one continuous piece. Like virtually all the objects that are known that are decorated in this particular technique, Minai painting, the overglaze decoration has been retouched at some point. So here, a shiny black material has been used to redo the hair and the faces, although for some reason they forgot to do this face. Whatever this substance is, I believe that earlier conservation showed that it could be removed with acetone. It's definitely not fired on as the original black pigment would have been. So it's definitely a recent intervention or a 20th century intervention. And like I say, so far so normal. This is totally the case with all the Minai wares pretty much that survive. It's on the underside of this object that things get weirder. So the lower part of this vessel has actually been adorned using the same black material with the outlines of two figures that mimic the standard figural type seen on Minai. So they're actually a little too big, so they're a little out of scale, but they are a very well observed and really quite practiced looking imitation of Minai figures, but they're done in this material that we know must be modern. Even stranger is the other side of this area where you can just see the feet of an animal and the traces of one figure here, the rest of which has been cleaned away. As far as I know, this incomplete erasure must have happened prior to the object's accession to the Cincinnati Art Museum in 1952. And the drawing in of the figures, I think, has to have taken place before the piece was put into the Victoria and Albert Museum by Dikran Kelekian in the early 20th century. So in its current state, this piece speaks of the undocumented practices of the faker's workshop. Someone in the modern era started the job of adding more figural decoration to the object, presumably to enhance its value, but for some reason they didn't try to finish it. Perhaps they probably lost confidence as they realized the sort of out of orientation and out of scale figures were going to look a bit plausible, however good the draftsmanship is. Another piece that raises an interesting but even more baffling set of questions is this one. This bowl, which has a design of a bull on the inside of it, it's rather lovely actually. Everything about this piece is strange. I have looked into its history. I discovered that it actually at one point was in the Dumbarton Oaks collection, and then they sold it back to Kelekian, which is indicative of the fact that they may have felt there was something wrong with it. Kelekian ended up selling it on to the Cincinnati Museum in amongst a large group of other pieces. And it's a very, very weird object. It feels, when you touch it, and the touch test is very important in this, it feels like a lumpy duvet. Basically, it's really lumpy. It does not feel like ceramic should feel at all. It's cracked in a strange way. I wonder if we're looking at actually a varnished surface. But also it has this bizarre exterior decoration, which looks, it really doesn't look, it's imitating cross and star tiles that you would see in medieval Iranian tile arrangements. But I've never seen it used as a design like this. And this looks totally 20th century to me. So this piece is a really interesting one that I think it would be really worthwhile doing some further investigation into this. But it has this amazing drawing of a bull. It's actually a really good depiction. So again, it speaks to the idea that there are levels of skill at work in some of these practices, even on an object like this, which I think is probably largely inauthentic. There are levels of skill at play that I think we should consider and think carefully about. Now, the materials analysis that I've been doing on the IU pieces is sort of maybe the last thing I'll show you today. I've been doing this, and I want to show you the possibilities for investigation of these objects through CT scanning, because that is something we've done at IU with our pieces, which are very much parallels to the pieces in the Cincinnati Museum. I've been doing a large-scale project on these pieces at IU, and this has involved a lot of collaboration. And now we've done thermoluminescence testing for dating, and we've done UV light imaging, and we did CT scanning. So computed tomography, I think is what it stands for. But you know, the one that you actually get for scanning bodies in hospitals. If you're having a brain scan or something like that, it may be done on the CT scanner. That actually turns out to be incredibly useful for some of these objects. The first one I want to show you is this, this bovine creature here. What it is, you can see it here. It's part of a group of zoomorphic pouring vessels. It's really a cute object. It has these lovely long eyelashes. It's very, very sweet. It was bought from the New York dealer Hassan Khan Manif in 1960. An initial examination of the piece showed quite clearly that it's got a lot of modern overpainting, as well as you can feel some joins on it. So we could tell it was fragmentary, but we couldn't quite tell what was going on from the outside. When we looked at this piece, we did a CT scan, and hopefully this will play so you can see it in the round, which is the great benefit of the CT scan. Everything that you see on this object, pause, let me get it to pause here. Everything you see on this object that's white is medieval glazed ceramic material, but it's not all from the same object. So you can see here that somebody has used bits cut to fit to fill in the missing part of the body. There's a section here that actually looks like it comes from the edge of a plate. So these are all medieval sherds, but from various different objects that are mixed together and then stuck together in order to create a finished composite, what is basically a composite object. This dark stuff is the modern fill material. Again, I would point you to the amount of skill involved in something like this. Let me get out of here. You can see the overpainting when you look at it up close, but it is very, very well done. It really speaks of a much higher level of skill than we typically attribute to the people doing this kind of work in the 20th century. There's a lot of complexity and finesse in the reconstruction of a very difficult form here. And then the last one that I'll show you of the two from IU, and this is it's another of the invisible hand of the art market. This vessel is part of that corpus of rockaware, so it's actually really closely linked to some of the pieces in the Cincinnati Museum. It also traveled through the art market in the early 20th century, and it actually also traveled through Kelekian's hands. You can see it here. It's actually one of the pieces that was auctioned off after Cincinnati had bought their pieces after Kelekian's death. IU bought it from another dealer, Fahim Kujakci, and then they acquired it in 1972, very shortly before Kujakci died. So looking at this piece, you can see that fractures and overpaint are visible. Much of it has actually been coated with a varnish to mimic the glaze of an unbroken surface. But most interesting is this handle, which shows every sign of being a modern replacement. You can tell the color is totally different. The CT scan confirmed this beyond a shadow of a doubt by revealing that the handle had actually been attached with 2 screws, top and bottom. Now, screws is a new one on me. I have seen pins before. The Metropolitan Museum published X-ray images of a piece that had a handle stuck on in the 20th century using metal pins here. I have never seen anyone do screws. It's a pretty aggressive means of attachment. What's interesting is that, again, even though it seems really clumsy, there is enough skill involved that they just avoid actually breaching the glazed wall of the interior of the vessel. I had a look, so it just doesn't quite go through. Driving in that lower screw, though, has created stress fractures all the way down the belly of the body. And yet this modern handle is professionally made. It looks professionally shaped. It's well made. I showed it to colleagues in the studio department, potter colleagues here, who were impressed by it. They said, you know, it's made by someone who knows what they're doing. And so I think we need to adjust our mindset a little bit in terms of how we think about these kinds of interventions on the object, not just as kind of shameful, but actually as now very important parts of the history of these pieces. So what I'm really trying to do with this object, with this whole project, is trying to, I mean, obviously one thing I'm doing is tracking down and documenting the ceramics collections of the Midwest, because I don't think they've had their fair due. But what I really want to do is reframe the craft skills of restoration, and I think we can call it faking sometimes as well, recognizing them as skills that speak of direct Indigenous participation in modern global capitalism. Now, craft skills in the late 19th and early 20th century Islamic world have been really underestimated to date, precisely because I think the field of art history has not yet been willing to recognize workshop restoration and faking as forms of skilled craftsmanship. While craft skills in the Middle East are usually portrayed as having withered and died in the 19th century with the advent of industrialization, they were in fact quite logically redirected towards the new market that was generated by colonial modernity and its fanatical harvesting of artifacts. So that is the remaking, the faking, and sometimes the outright forgery of historical artworks. So I want to conclude today by coming back to the fabulous collection in Cincinnati itself. The museum has a truly impressive collection of Islamic ceramics, and they were acquired during the period of Philip Adams' custodianship, and they were bought from one of the most important 20th century dealers in this material. The Cincinnati group is really very rich indeed in terms of just the sheer quality of the pieces, but it also represents a very rich scene for the institutional histories of these objects as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of these pieces out on display again, and to hearing more of the stories that they're going to tell to museum goers, young and old, as well as to curators and visiting scholars. So thank you very much. Now, Helen, would you like me to stop screen share?
No, I'd like you to keep
it
down
up.
because
Okay.
I believe some of the questions are you'll want to use your screen for that. But I definitely want to thank you for one heck of a presentation. I guess it's one of those things that you're always so pleased when your museum is shown to be out there and doing so well and being a leader in the field. Yeah. That's always incredible with that.
I think there's really a lot to be very proud of. Not just the pieces, but also the work that's been done on them is really terrific.
That we have an amazing staff at the Art Museum. They're just amazing. I know, Kelly, you're on, and Kelly, the presentation you made for the Friends of Asian Art have been phenomenal, and we really thank you for all that you are doing for us on that one. So we have some questions, and let me pull up my chat window to look at those. So, do you know what mineral source is in the blue pigments?
Yes, at least for some of them, it is cobalt. There are increasingly a number of studies of material analysis studies that have suggested that lapis lazuli may sometimes also have been a pigment in medieval Iran, a glazed pigment rather in medieval Iran, but primarily it seems to be cobalt. For the later periods, I'm just wondering if that still holds true. I think it does. Certainly for the medieval material, it's cobalt, and it's actually it's turning out to be pretty useful because cobalt, travels with other elements, and actually there's been an increasing amount of work done that's actually able to locate where pieces might be coming from. Of course, in this mess of unprovenanced objects, to be better able to locate where they might be coming from through the actual cobalt compounds that are in the glaze. So as best I know, we're looking at cobalt in every case on this screen, for instance.
Okay, I'm going to jump on that one just because there's a vague memory I have of cobalt is one of those minerals that's not widely distributed across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're talking some good international trade going on, at least in the minerals. Is that correct?
That is correct. So Iran is one of the places that does have cobalt mines. There's a cobalt mine near Kashan, in fact, which probably contributed to Kashan's status as a major site for ceramics production. So yes, what's interesting is trying to work out with the Syrian material where the cobalt is coming from there. But there also seems, and this is very tentative, but I've read recently a study that's suggesting that we may be seeing, you can just about start trying to work out some sort of shifts in global trade networks that go through, because we seem to see a rise in some kind of European source of cobalt coming in. I'm trying to remember at what point, and displacing Iranian cobalt. But there is a very, Iranian cobalt is very, very important in both the Middle Eastern and in the East Asian ceramics production as well, because I think, at least for a time, cobalt was coming from Iran and Afghanistan to China as well.
And cobalt becomes very important in Japan too.
Yes, right.
Very important. Okay. Next question. Were you able to translate the calligraphy on these pieces? And if so, what do they say?
Some of them. So the Raqqa wares, for instance, I'm fine and comfortable with that because they have pretty generic Arabic blessings on them, most of them. Much more difficult, I'm not a Persianist, so much more difficult even for proper Persianists are the inscriptions on ones like the this one with the Persian poetry on it here. However, I did find, going through the archives, that in fact Abdullah Guchani, God rest his soul, he actually died very recently, was one of the foremost scholars of ceramic inscriptions in Persian, had actually done some translations of some of the pieces in the collection. I think he'd done, or at least he'd done transliterations where he'd transcribed the Persian. So that stuff is there and could all go out to a Persianist to look at. I don't remember if anyone has translated successfully the poetry on this one. I'd have to go and check my notes. But typically, I mean, what we're looking at with most of them is in line with what we commonly see in the medieval Islamic material generally, is that, is that you have these longer inscriptions written in cursive, which are in Persian, and they're typically poetic. You have shorter inscriptions, often in an angular script, which are written in Arabic, and they're much more often benedictory expressions or sort of pious expressions like Baraka Kamila and Naima Shamala, which means like perfect blessing and enfolding grace. They're sort of good wishes, basically, on a lot of the objects. Some of them, for instance, this one here, I'm curious, and I mean, it's horribly difficult script on it, but I'm curious about whether it has more information on it beyond just those generic blessings. Because this one I'm also interested in because it has a twin in the Rhode Island School of Design. I discovered that there's one that looks to be made from the same mold as this one. So I'm really curious about this, and this is part of my project too, is trying to get further with the inscriptions. But certainly for the Persian ones, I'm going to be handing them off to my Persianist colleagues at some point.
Translations. Yeah. Okay. Would you recommend removing Kelekian's writing from the plate, or is that now part of the history of the plate?
I would definitely, I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I would definitely advocate for keeping it. It's really part of the history of the piece now. And it's not, as far as I can tell, it's not doing anything. I don't think, it looks like it's just regular ink. I don't think it's going to do anything to the glaze. So I don't, unless there's an urgent conservation need, which I don't think there can be, because that looks like it's been on there for at least a century, that inscription. I would definitely keep it. I think it's a fascinating little sort of telltale mark of the time on the market for these pieces.
the whole history of collecting and forgeries, and it's just incredible. Okay, next question. Were the pieces created for royal or wealthy patrons or for commoners?
That's a very good question. With most of this material, because typically we don't have, for instance, named patrons, and also ceramics. Ceramics is an interesting one because you get forms of production like luster. A piece like this one, you do have to wonder if this was possibly a royal commission or something like that. It doesn't have to be, but it clearly had to be for somebody really at the top, somebody high up in society, because it's so, I mean, luster is a very difficult technique to do. It's expensive, and to do it on this scale with this level of skill is absolutely jaw-dropping. So this piece, probably above all others, I would say this piece is closest to something that we might say we have a case for saying that this looks like it's, if not for an imperial or a royal patron, at least for the top of the elite. Other types of ceramics, I mean, what we're not seeing here, and of course there isn't much of it in the collection, is unglazed commonware, which of course is actually the vast bulk of what there is. Any archaeological excavation, that's the huge majority of what they're pulling out. It's the vast, vast bulk of what was made. And as far as we can tell, you can think of it almost equivalent to the plastic of its day. The volumes of unglazed ware that were thrown away in the rubbish tips at Fustat, for instance, are just absolutely incredible. So glazed ceramics like these done in fine techniques. There's a lot of luster in this collection, which is an expensive technique. There's minai, which is expensive and difficult too. Polychrome pieces like this one. All of this is, it's certainly above the average. But it's probably made for the market. So it's made for wealthy consumers, but probably not royal pieces, I would say. You can see pieces like this, for instance, there's a lot of luster like this from the 17th century, which actually we know really there was quite a lot of it, and it was kind of a liquid asset, actually. There was an entire, there was a form of pawning that existed in Iran in the 18th century, where you could put your ceramics in hock and get money for them. So it really was like an actual tradable liquid asset as well.
Amazing. Were some of these objects actually used, or were they just for display?
That is such a good question, and it's always one that I'm kind of stuck with. We don't really have a clear sense, I don't think, of the potential use life of these objects. Some of them, when you get to the later period, really do, it seems like they've only ever been display objects. So something like this one, this 17th century luster, probably a display object from the beginning. And this is a fascinating piece. This is, it's one of a large group of ceramics that were found in a village in Dagestan. And nobody knows how they got there. And early 20th century dealers started turning up, finding them, recognizing them as they're mostly, I think, 15th, 16th century Iranian material. But still to this day, it's not actually clear, or 16th and 17th century Iranian material. It's still not clear how they ended up in this village in Dagestan. They're called the so-called Kubachi wares after the village. They were on display in people's houses in the village of Kubachi. They don't look to ever have been used. Some of them have drill holes in the foot that appear to be from, that were there when the piece was fired, which indicates the likelihood that they were always intended as display pieces. So it's really hard. Sometimes we're groping around and guessing a lot. And back to that thing too, that there was clearly a huge amount of totally plain or molded, sometimes unglazed ware that was getting used. It's very difficult to say, and it's a really interesting question. I don't have a good answer to that. And I think we always end up having to sort of conjecture on the basis of where we think it might fit in the hierarchy of materials, Sometimes you get things like this minai piece, for instance, the fact that you have three figures here who are on they're upside down to the other ones. So you have like different registers. That is kind of suggestive of an object that's getting passed around, getting passed from hand to hand and actually being used. So there are things in the design of them that sometimes seem to suggest that, but it's pretty hard to say.
That's fascinating, because Japanese tea bowls that are older, they actually look for use Actually, some of the green tea left in cracks and things like that.
Mm.
And they mend their own. That's a whole nother topic, and we won't get that one. Are you familiar with the work of Japanese national living treasure Kato Tokuo and his son Kobe?
I am not. No.
Before the 1979 revolution, they studied lusterware in Iran and Persia and brought it back to Japan.
Oh, yes.
And
Okay, that is actually ringing a bell. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
We can send you a bunch of information on that if you like.
I would love that.
We visited the museum that's formerly their house. And one of their descendants is actually a dear friend of ours who's still in the area. So when you go to Japan, we'll hook you up with him. Get you the personal tour.
Now we're all traveling again. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, won't that be lovely when we can travel again? And at least right now, the last question that's been submitted is, when did lapis lazuli start being incorporated in Iranian pieces?
It's a very good question. I don't know. And it's only actually been in pretty recent studies that I've seen it raised as the likely pigment. So it's tantalizing because it raises the possibility that it might actually be widespread. We don't really know. It's only come up in a couple of studies that I've seen. It looks to be later than the cobalt, but like I say, I feel like the information at the moment is so scant that it's very hard to say. It's not 100% clear to me if those studies are really dealing with something that's pretty much anomalous, or if they do point the way to actually a more widespread phenomenon that we should actually be thinking of it as a more widely used pigment. It's quite hard. I mean, I don't know how you get lapis lazuli to work as a blue color in glaze, because it goes gray. I mean, it's gray when it's ground, and I didn't think it actually worked that way in glaze. And so it seems to raise some questions about how it was actually used as a technology.
Thanks. I was looking, I guess Ainsley had to leave, but for those people on the watching, Kelly, if you could put your microphone back on. I know our galleries for Islamic are in flux, but just in case anybody wants.
Here, just so you know.
Oh, okay. So Ainsley, I know we're in flux, but are any of these pieces, or any Islamic pieces currently on display? I'm thinking of the room in front of the Damascus room, if those pieces are still there.
They're not, no. So the entire suite of galleries from the ancient Middle East through the main Islamic gallery where the mihrab is, the South Asian gallery, and then outside the Damascus room are all closed currently for renovation. But we have dates that I can entice people with if they'd like.
I would say entice us.
Excellent. So the ancient Middle East galleries, the quote unquote Hannah wing of the museum, and the Mihrab gallery, which will open with a new name, the Islamic gallery, are going to open in December. The public opening is December 18th. And then the room outside the Damascus room and then the reinterpreted Damascus room will open in March of 2022.
Thank you very much. Boy, what a lovely Christmas present for us all.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Kelly and I are hard at work, as you can imagine, and anyone else in the museum on this call.
Oh, yeah. I think it's just amazing what the museum has been able to accomplish even during the pandemic. I can't say enough good things about you all there. So to wrap this up, I want to thank Dr. Graves first for helping us begin our conservation fund work to assist the museum. Especially we're interested in bringing things to display to people, and you helped uncover some cool stories that we can brag about, hopefully in the new galleries. We got some great funding for these galleries too, which are really amazing. Then I want to remind everybody that this will be posted on YouTube. And this concludes the CAAS programming for this 2021 season. And please check the Cincinnati Asian Art Society webpage and our Facebook page for information on future events. Please contact me if you have topics you'd like us to present in our next season. Our board will be meeting soon. Although we are facing a lot of uncertainty right now on whether we will be able to have public programming at the Art Museum in the fall, or we will be virtual again for a little while. We just don't know how things are going, but things are looking up.